Hi, everyone. I'm so happy that you can join us today. I'm Elizabeth Alfano, host of the Plant-Based Business Hour and founder of Plant Powered Consulting. We have so much to discuss with these experts here on the panel. We're going to be talking about how technology is changing our food system. I want to get into it, but first, let me introduce everybody. David Benzukin, thank you for being with me. You are the founder of Mission Plant and do incredible work. We're going to get into all that you do very soon. Monica Talbert, co-founder and CEO of the Plant-Based Seafood Company. Thank you for being here. And Max Rye, chief strategist and co-founder of Turtle Tree. You guys are doing incredible work. Let's get into it. We are all part of the innovative technology that is indeed changing our food system. Let's start with Max, since he has such a tech background. Max, just the first basic question, and then we'll get into more details. How is technology changing our food system?
Tremendously. I think what we're seeing is a huge advancement in technology. My background actually is from the traditional tech world. And in that world, things move so rapidly that almost overnight, everything changed. And we feel that today. And I think the same thing's actually starting to happen in the food industry. That is really exciting. I think biotech has transitioned into food significantly. And I think there's a lot of exciting things that are coming up.
Yeah, it's so exciting. Is it too exciting? I know that sounds weird, but I want to throw it to David. Sometimes people have a tough time digesting, for lack of a better expression, all this tech that we're talking about in their food. What do you think about that?
Sure. It can be used in the foods we're actually eating, but it can also be a tool to understand the foods we're eating. And so I think that when we're thinking about how we use technology, it doesn't have to concern people that we're using technology. It should really be understood that it is a means to many different ends that can be achieved however we choose to. So what I mean by that is that we can use technology to study our food, even our most natural food sources, to see what's in them and to see how they interact with our bodies. We can use technology to create foods that are more sustainable and healthier for us. And, technology is really just a means to an end. We choose how to direct it.
Certainly, we all agree here on this panel for sure. But I think, and I hope Monica is still with us. Monica, you are, if she is, let me know. She may not be. Max, maybe you can talk to me about this because you have a consumer-facing product. It will be when you're in mass distribution with Turtle Tree Milk, both human breast milk and animal milk that you do through cellular agriculture. What kind of anticipation do you think is going to come down, if any, of a backlash from the consumer?
I'm going to take ride a little bit of what David was saying about technology being used to analyze our existing foods as well. And I think that's very important because as we move forward, the consumers are getting much smarter as well. So I think consumers these days are looking into what's even in their existing food supply. So in that vein, I think when we start looking at these new products, what they're going to see analytically and scientifically, hey, this stuff is actually probably way better for us. There's no hormones, there's no antibiotics, there's all the stuff that we're used to having in our food system. Now we can actually create better for you type of food. So I think with enough education, enough support, there's a lot of push coming from the consumer end for sustainability. Everything's going to come together and people are going to be much more open to the idea of a lot of these new novel foods.
I'm going to jump in then and riff on that, but this is a casual conversation. So you guys just, pop in here and there. I mean, I'll throw it to you, but just pop in as you see fit. What's exciting to me about this is the time of the empowered consumer. So it used to be that the consumer had to accept whatever advertising message was coming down to them. Milk does a body good. Well, no one believes that anymore because the stats don't prove that out. And then that campaign was sued and now no longer exists. So, the consumer is savvy. They've got Google at their fingertips. They've been to the plant-based rodeo a time or two, and they know that not everything that comes down the pipeline is actually correct. So I think this consumer driving this is going to be very exciting. I wonder if either of you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think that consumers are really empowered, as you said, and every single day they are choosing with their dollars and with their forks what they're going to be putting in their bodies and what manufacturers should be producing and what growers should be growing. And with the information we're getting through technology and through science, through research, to understand what chemical composition is in the foods that we're already eating, and how processed or chemical the foods that we've been given for years and told are natural actually are, we can start to appreciate the benefit of what we're doing in assessing what we're eating now and in the future. And the great thing about a lot of the technology that we're looking at is it's actually creating opportunities to eat foods that are made in much more sanitary conditions, much more controlled settings, where we can avoid a lot of the risks that come with concentrated animal feeding operations, or with monocropped crops that are being grown with a lot of pesticides and flown across the world to be able to feed us. So there are a lot of opportunities to use technology now to provide us the most essential nutrition in the most bioavailable way, in the most sustainable way, to sustain us and the planet for years to come.
Yes, we have a newcomer to our talk today. Jerry Gomez, thanks for being with us. You are the former CEO of Le Pain Quotidien. You've worked with a lot of companies like Burger King, etc. So you're going to have a great take on the conversation that we're just having right now. I'll circle back to you in a minute because I want to get Max's opinion on this. Then also because Max puts out, as I say, a consumer-facing product. For those of us who might not know Max, what are some of the benefits that we get through cellular grown proteins, not including the animal, that then allow us to have milk from an animal and human breast milk, actually, that doesn't involve human or animal?
I think that's a great question. There's obviously, we can't scale up human breast milk the way it is today. I mean, it's for babies. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
Gotcha.
Okay, the camera just kind of went in and out. But I think the value of what's inside of human milk is tremendous. All the biggest players, Danone, Nestle, Fonterra, all the biggest players have done a lot of research in this area. And what they found is stuff inside of human breast milk is worth its weight in gold. It's got these amazing beneficial components in it, the proteins, the complex sugars, even the milk fats are very, very different than what we get from cow milk. So if we can produce that and we can actually showcase the safety and efficacy of it as well, I personally believe that it's going to be a future functional foods. That can be a big part of what everyone ends up consuming, not just infants. And this trend has already started. If you look at a few of the big companies in Europe, there's already human milk complex sugars that are going into foods. They've been known to treat IBS as well as a number of other things. I think it's quite exciting where we're headed, and I think that we're no longer restricted to animal agriculture to be able to get to these things.
Yeah, I just want to quickly summarize for those listening. So some of the benefits that you can get from cellular created proteins without the animal. So, we grow a lot of grains. These grains have fiber, they have protein. Do we give them to people? No, we give them to animals. And then we give those animals land, and we give them time, and we give them antibiotics, and we give them hormones. And then we stuff them together so that they live on top of each other. And there's this pandemic risk. None of that is the case with cellular agriculture, where you're just using the cells. So you save on land, you save on time, you save on water, you save on pandemic risk, you don't use antibiotics, you don't use hormones. And incidentally, you don't have to cut down all those trees to grow all those grains to inefficiently give to animals, which could have been given to people. You get to keep those trees. Why do we care? Trees pull carbon from the air. So there is such a benefit story here. Glad you're back, Monica, to tell the consumer that it's very exciting. And I think when we work deeply in tech, we forget, like, oh yeah, there's this whole consumer facing story out there, which is why I'm so glad Jerry's with us. Jerry, you've had all these consumer facing brands that you've worked with, Le Pain Quotidien, Burger King, among many others. We were talking before you hopped in. Do you think the consumer is ready to accept this?
So it's an interesting discussion. And frankly, I debated this back in early 2018 when I was really getting into the details with Le Pain. And I remember I had just attended Singularity University. And while we were there, we had a chance to visit a lot of these plant-based companies. I remember one in particular happened to be Just. And I was so fascinated by it that I remember 3 or 4 months later, we were already in trials to start changing our eggs in the U.S. and the U.S. market. And so do I think they're ready? more ready today than they were in early 2018 and now in 2019 and obviously in 2021. One of the gaps that I think that's still an opportunity for all of us is really the education of the consumer, whether you're talking about someone at home when they're preparing their own food or they're coming into your establishment, both of which I've dealt with now, is a massive gap. So if there's a fundamental opportunity that we have is how do we educate them? Because the more educated they become, they're going to turn over the back of the pack. And right now, whether they're looking at an American brand or a European brand or an Asian Pacific brand, there are a lot of ingredients in there. So they don't quite understand it yet. And they're going to start getting more elegant, more sophisticated in their approach. And then a true test will be against those brands that haven't really figured out the right label that they want to hold themselves accountable against, right? There are many today in plant-based chicken or the wet extrusion or dry extrusion that have anywhere from 18 to 25 different ingredients to make a burger or to make a sausage. And I think ultimately a clean deck will prevail, healthy deck will prevail, but above that, taste has to remain king, because it doesn't matter how healthy, how clean, if it doesn't taste good, people aren't going to eat it.
Yes, it always comes down to taste, price, and convenience. I think those things, I quote GFI there, those things, without those things, you really don't have a market. So once you nail taste, price, and convenience, then you can work on educating the consumer. I have some thoughts on that, but I'd rather bring in Monica first to talk to us about educating the consumer, because if there's something people don't understand, I mean, you might say like Burger King, I get it. I know what that is. It's a burger. Now it's an Impossible Whopper. Okay, burger to burger, I get it. You tell people plant-based seafood, they don't know what the heck you're talking about. So how has your consumer education process been going with the plant-based seafood company?
Yeah, it's a bit different for seafood because seafood has that health halo, right? So we have a challenge that I don't think, the alternative meat, like red meat and chicken, is facing, because a lot of flexitarians that are decreasing the amount of meat that they're eating, they're actually looking to seafood because it does have this health halo. And so that is a challenge for us. And it always comes down to why. So we actually started off with a new series on Instagram, just educating our followers on why plant-based seafood, and taking them through this journey, that, teaching them things that they might not have known, and then hopefully getting to the point where the consumers are asking why not plant-based seafood. And so that's our goal. And I'm sure Max and David were probably speaking about this before I hopped on, and I'm just going to echo what Jerry said about taste is king. So I think when you're trying to introduce novel technologies to food, you have to be just nailing it on taste. That's an assumption, and you have to have the health factor. So you have to, at least in the mind of the consumer, it has to be a healthier alternative. I think those are two assumptions that, just have to be there in the beginning. And then the challenge after that is how you craft the story. It's all about the story, right? And Elizabeth, I was listening to your podcast with the Whole Foods CEO, Mike Kern, and I loved what he said
Walter
Robb, sorry. Excuse me, Food 2.0, and it talked about transparency. So the education piece and the story that we want to tell has to be weaved in the transparency of the technology. I think that's really important. Consumers need to know how it's made, need to trust how it's made. And then the second part of the story needs to be what I just spoke about, is why. We need to give consumers a reason why to choose these alternatives, and why we exist in the first place, right? Why all of these products are even on the market. And to me, you have to start with telling the story of what's at stake. And I think that we could do a better job of just telling that story to consumers. And then once you tell consumers what's at stake and they understand, then you give them this vivid picture of what can be if we avoid this crisis, this food insecurity crisis that we're going through now, and how it's going to be exacerbated by 2050, adding almost 3 billion more people onto the planet. So give them this picture of what it could be if we change now our behaviors. Bring them into the story at that point, and position them as the hero. The consumer needs to be thought of, and we all are as consumers. We are the hero in this story. And I think that having them have that personal stake and changing the food system and giving that emotional response, I think is really going to convince consumers to open their minds and change their behaviors. And whereas they'll think, a couple years ago, I never would have told you I would try a cell-based product. Now they're like, okay, well, I see the bigger picture. I see my role in that bigger picture. Maybe I'll now be more open to trying it.
Yeah, I love that you position the consumer as the hero. So they have a vested interest and they've got something to gain. You've got those two really strong stories there. The benefit of all the resources we save. So as we go from 7.6 billion people on the planet to 9.8 by 2050, according to the UN, we're not getting more land and we're not getting more water. So those resources that we save. And then for seafood in particular, Monica, you have a great story because the oceans are dying, if not dead. I mean, you're really saving the oceans. David Benzaquin with his former business, Ocean Hugger, knows something about that too. So I think there's those two really strong arguments, but I'd like to throw it to, I'll say, David, what about this argument to the consumer? Technology in our food actually is not new. This has been something, hybrid fruits and fermented precision fermentation for insulin. We no longer factory farm pigs for insulin because it's too messy. There's too much risk of it being contaminated because they're all living in their own feces, et cetera. So we don't do that. We use precision fermentation, and that's how we have insulin. So technology in our food and our lives is not new. David?
Absolutely. When you see what's been used, how technology has been used for years to optimize either sales or our food quality, we can really see that it's not new. And the difference now is that it's being used very intentionally and very publicly and very transparently for good. And for years, it's been used to increase the bliss point of how much salt, sugar, and fat we're eating, or increase shelf life at the peril of quality or nutritional value, or increase yield at the peril of farmers' pocketbooks. And so now we're saying, we are going to be very transparent about what we're doing. And we're doing so because we want to protect the planet, because we want to protect the oceans, because we want to improve people's health and feed these growing populations. And so I think that it's unfortunate that we're being scrutinized more seriously than when companies have been using technology for so many decades. But this is our opportunity to say food is chemical in its chemistry already, yes, even on the tree. And, I hear what Jerry's saying about clean labels. I agree that I think that there are a number with the number one factor, with the number one self-reported reason for people eating more plant-based being health. I agree that clean labels and thinking about how we make those ingredients as understandable as possible is important. But I think it's also important to recognize the degree to which taste is king. The reason that non-dairy milk represents 16% of all fluid milk sales in the US is not because we spent all this time telling people that cows were suffering, or because we talked about how much dairy farms were dirty, even though they are. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. But the reason that changed is because the amount of innovation allowed for such a diversity of products in the market that with cow's milk only being able to be cow's milk, and with millions of plants being able to provide different nutritional, functional, taste, sensory experiences, consumers vote with their dollars and vote with their taste buds for what they like. And that's what's ultimately going to be king. People are going to choose based on what's available, based on what's affordable, and based on what's absolutely delicious. I know we're all talking about the importance of taste, but I think when people self-report that they really prioritize sustainability and health, unfortunately, they don't always act on it. And I think it's really important that we lead with why it's just so delicious that you don't have to even eat them. Nobody's eating animal products because they like how the sausage is made. They're eating the animal products in lieu of in spite of how the sausage is made. And it's our job to say, you don't have to contribute to those systems. Here's something delicious that you don't have to sacrifice with.
Yeah, I love what David's saying. I want to riff off of that and throw it to Max. Plant-based dairy also has a tailwind because 65% of America is lactose intolerant. That's higher in Asian American communities and African American communities. But definitely the innovation has been there so that those items now are so good. Max, do you ever worry that there'll be a backlash from people saying, well, technology in my food is bad? So obviously it's up to us to change that story. But, GMO, they lost control of that conversation. You try to tell somebody now today that, well, GMO is only nefarious depending on how it's used, they won't hear you. So an organic, potentially one could argue that they lost control of that argument as well. So how do we not lose control of this argument that cellular agriculture or plant-based innovation is not only not new, it's also not bad?
Yeah, I think the not new, first of all, agriculture, I mean, growing tissue, this type of work has been going on for decades. So that part of it is fine on the scientific side. But when it comes to food, it is a new area. We do have to do a lot of work on education. So that's going to be a big part of it. But like what Monica said, we're going to get to a certain point where people are going to ask, why not? Wait a minute. Why would I choose the former?
Yeah.
That is going to be something that we're going to get to at some point. And technology is actually going to help us do that. If we can showcase this through these educational campaigns and working with these consumers, hey, this milk that we're drinking with this cellular technology is scientifically better for you. Clinical trials have shown it's actually better for you than the other stuff. And by the way, we can produce milk without the lactose altogether. The technology allows us to be able to do some of these things that we haven't been able to do in the past. I think we're going to get to a certain point where, I'm also already doing this myself. I'm always thinking about, hey, is this product actually good for me as well, or is it highly processed? So I'm starting to think about stuff like that, and that's that's happening across the board with a lot of different folks. I think cell agriculture, this entire space, is going to get to a point where people are going to find this food is much better to consume than the other counterparts that are out there.
Yeah, it's such an exciting time to be alive because really we are living through a major industrial revolution as we shift really the entire food supply system. If you think about it, it's not just the products, the end consumers, but then all the supplies that go into it. It's really a fascinating time. So far, we've been talking about the consumer and how empowered they are and how they're driving this, but it's also corporations. I'd like to riff with Jerry about how much corporations are seeing either the dollar signs here or the environmental story. I'm not even going to consider that they're thinking about the animal story, but how much are they driving this as well and the innovation behind the products?
Frankly, I think you're seeing multiple dimensions converging now. There are some legacy traditional businesses that understand it and are putting some serious dollars behind it, while frankly others understand what's happening and don't want to left behind either from the consumer or from the technology, ultimately understanding that there's a commercial bent that they need to keep in mind. So I think there are definitely two work streams here, but ultimately they're embracing it. They know either it's on trend or there's a commercial viability. Either way, it's happening. Now, the motives may be different, Elizabeth, but it's happening, and it's happening in real time. And that's at the retailer level. They're pushing. You have the food service industry is pushing, and then you also have the restaurant industry is pushing. Those three main channels today, which make up a vast majority of the outlets or the touch point for the consumer, are pushing these changes. Industry, on the other hand, is reacting. Some of them are obviously leading, but they're reacting to the commercial viability of their economic model. So if we fast forward 10 years from now, which of these large conglomerates will still exist? And how many of their existing portfolio brands will remain in their portfolio assets? I mean, we've seen a lot of North American brands have shed 30, 40 sub-brands and have quietly done it. Why? Because they understand the commercial viability of their model. So I think it's happening real time, but it's only being reinforced simply, I believe, that depending on the track you're on, either you're doing it for either health, animal welfare, or sustainability, and everything Monica talked about, the education piece, that's one track. But the other track is really, frankly, if we're being concrete, there is a commercial bent and a commercial viability that is happening in real time, and that we cannot neglect that and bypass that. That's a real fact.
Well, that's one of the reasons why when people say to me, and I don't hear it as much anymore, but still I do hear it, oh, this is a fad. In the 70s, there was this big push for natural and organic and vegan. And of course, the 80s came around and just stomped on that. And I always say, well, this is different because it's actually the combination of the pull from the consumer and the push from industry, because industry realizes this is a lot better for their bottom line because it's less resource intensive. So it's a very interesting time when those two things come together with this joint mission, even though they could come to it from different avenues. It is ultimately a joint mission. And the innovation that comes out of that is so very exciting. And then ultimately, you see new jobs come out of that. And nothing switches your mindset than a paycheck. So
if I can add to that, Elizabeth, if I can jump in to what Jerry's saying as well, it's tremendous. Every single infant formula company in the world is reached out and looked at how they can access this technology. Everybody's seeing the shift. They're seeing this new technology is going to, if we don't catch up, we're going to die. Some of these companies are really worried that if they don't innovate fast enough, that they're going to be left in the dust. It's already happening, as David mentioned earlier, with the fluid milk market. What's next? I think there's a lot of concern there. So some of the biggest cheesemakers in the world are looking at how they could use new technologies to serve the new consumers and be more efficient, a number of different things, be more sustainable. But across the board, I had a meeting last week with a Japanese company that's more than 100 years old, from 1905, and they were like, "Oh, listen, we've never done this, but we want to know how this technology works. We want to see how we can implement it. We know our consumers in Japan are all about organic and this and that, but we think they're all going to buy into this." So I think some of the most traditional companies are all also looking into the same area and are very aggressive.
Yeah, it's an exciting time. I work with a bunch of ingredient companies through my consulting firm, and they're all looking at plant-based protein in a way they never have considered, and they're all 100+ old businesses. It's very exciting.
I also, just really quickly, I'll jump in right before I got on this panel, read that Cargill is looking to acquire seafood alternative companies. So that is also just a huge sign to what's to come. The fact that Cargill is getting involved, in plant-based seafood is pretty telling.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
And in my last company, when I was doing plant-based seafood as well, I was approached by the 5 largest tuna companies within months of launching, and was being flown all over the world to speak to, companies whose entire bottom line is reliant on fishing the oceans empty of tuna. So things are changing. I guess, if it's okay, I have a question for the panel, Elizabeth. Speaking of corporate involvement in the space, I absolutely celebrate collaboration with industry, and I think it's essential because domination of supply chains and of distribution channels is so significant that I think we have to leverage the strengths there. For example, Coca-Cola and Pepsi, in the United States, control so much of institutional food service where they have exclusive contracts for their products or things like that. So how we enter these markets requires collaboration. I guess the challenge that I see is that while I believe there are a lot of people in those corporations who are, whether they're in it for the money or not, I actually think a lot of them are in it for the right reasons, but they have a concern, and it's why I see a lot of visionary CEOs being let go. They have a concern that they're not able to return the kind of quick dividends for their shareholders if they invest and focus on long-term innovation. So they'd rather cut costs and focus on margins, and they're willing to lose 1-2% market share in the blue box mac and cheese or in the conventional dairy or whatever it may be. And they're seeing that bleeding because they're maintaining their overall profits. And when they know that investing, it's like if I have to spend $10 on a new light bulb rather than one, I'm too scared that, I'll be judged for spending that $10 today, even if the reality is it'll keep me from losing so much more in the future. So how do we respond to the economic model where shareholders are so liquid with how they trade stocks that companies are needing to profit today and not in 10 years and not in 5 years when the returns would be seen from these innovation investments?
I want to quickly say one sentence. I'll open it up to everybody else to just hop in as you see fit. You have the consumer investor as well. So I think you're seeing more interest, at least I see it from where I sit, in the person who wants to start putting money into their portfolio for plant-based options, cellular agriculture. So there's more and more of that demand coming from the private sector to invest in these options. You guys, what do you think?
Well, I think Paul Foreman did an amazing job. By the way, if people don't know who he is, he's the ex-CEO of Unilever and Nestle. About 10 years ago, I think, when he took over as Unilever, there was a lot of thoughts around how fast you can move and make profits. And he said, hold up, I want to change the way we do things. And he really set a longer term goal with sustainability in play. And this is a visionary type of person that I think Dave is talking about. I think it starts from the top. if you lead in that way, you're gonna get the investors behind you, the ones that actually matter. And if you can set that vision, you can actually execute on it and understand that this is part of the future. Now, there are a lot of corporations that's not their model. That's just not, and they may be the ones who get left behind. And that has been the case with some of these that are out there. But I do believe there's enough of them out there that are spending money in the right places. And by the way, different corporations have different models. Some of these guys have also looked at external innovations and acquisitions as a way to move forward. That's also something that's being adopted. Very little R&D is happening internally in many of these corporations, actually. And what they started doing is over a period of time is say, okay, we're not capable of internally doing this type of innovation. We can't move fast enough. So what they're looking at is just partnering or acquisitions of companies that are making these type of leaps.
I'll just add to that, most of these investors, investors being the stockholders who are putting pressure on the companies to make these profit margins, they all have kids. And I think pressure comes from home as well. I just think that pressure is coming from all areas. And those sort of people who have put their stick in the ground, they're going to start to shift. Perhaps I'm optimistic. Jerry and Monica, what do you think?
Jerry, I'll let you go.
No, great. It's interesting conversation because oftentimes if you talk to an existing CEO that's in a current chair, if you look at past dividend performance or past historic performance or horizon that they're in, it really is when they take the decision, right? So it's on the maturity of the CEO's role in that company. You can often link it to their level of bold activity. And so oftentimes what we find is, having ran a couple companies now, that oftentimes you have the first 120 days and then you bolt on another 6 months to really start shaping the board strategy and start redefining that. It's very difficult to have from the CEO perspective after you've already committed to a strategy and whether it's working or partially working to completely shift it, because typically particularly in the middle market asset, I haven't led a publicly traded company, but for a portfolio company within a middle market in a private equity business, there are some challenges there because the shareholders are very different. They're not necessarily worried about all of the social implications. Elizabeth, what you talked about now about the pressure from family members, that is fantastic. I think that is becoming a real act because today, many of the children, whether they're Gen Z, Y, or whatever you would like, they're now looking at returning to the family business or are in the family business and are taking greater responsibility. A lot of the conversations we're having today, you see many of the investment managers, many of the directors, many of the MDs that are now the second generation, the generation that's going to take that business forward. So at least from that perspective, there is a lot of pressure. The other part that I think is important to note is these companies that are sitting and they're publicly traded businesses, many of them are looking at how the aggregation of the different channels will help improve their business. So whether you're talking about delivery, omni-channel, everything relating to those channels, the aggregation of those channels does allow that CEO to reposition their strategy back to whatever business, whether you're talking about industry, whether you're talking about retail, food service, or restaurants. I think the aggregation of those channels allows them to broaden the conversation and recalibrate that board, because oftentimes the boards are really focused on one or two or three channels, but looking at all the channels and how to aggregate them allows them to reposition their entire strategy. And I think that's what we're seeing now in a lot of these big PLCs here in Europe or in EMEA. And of course, some of my colleagues in the US, as we're talking about, because for myself, I went from a retail, moved over to restaurant, and then spent time at CPG, and now heavily focused on plant-based. I'm seeing the aggregation of this is a huge opportunity for anyone that's in the consumer sector, whether you're talking about shoes, makeup, plastic, powder. It's just, it's here and it's here to stay. I'll leave you one last thing that I think is fascinating. And I used it on a call earlier. I do believe that the rate we're depleting our planet, the natural resources, whether it's the soil, and you could sort of tongue in cheek this as well. I don't think Elon Musk will colonize Mars fast enough for us to, in essence, have enough resources. And it's sort of funny, but if you think about it, I mean, we're burning up the resources.
100%.
We don't have another planet to colonize. So it's tongue in cheek, but at the reality, if we measure that, I think it's a good takeaway for everyone.
Thank you for that. And I love what you're saying there, the aggregation of the channels. That's something I interview a lot of CEOs. That's something that's new that I will be bringing forth. Thanks for that. Monica, did you want to chime in, or I have a last question for everybody?
Yeah, go ahead. I think they nailed it.
So when Jerry was talking earlier, he was saying, 10 years or so, that number was thrown out. And I'd love to go across the board, maybe starting with Monica. What are your predictions? I used to ask this question on the Plant-Based Business Hour for 10 years, but I'm not even going to do that. I'm going to say 3 to 5 years. What are your predictions for the food supply system as we move forward?
The food supply system. Can you be more specific?
Well, anywhere in the chain. I was broad so that you could fit in wherever you want in your business model. Sure. Where do you see things changing the next 3 to 5 years from where plant-based seafood sits?
I see it changing. Actually, I'll go in the traditional seafood industry because I think a lot of impact potential is there. Is what I'm really passionate about as well. Just the existence of plant-based seafood, just the existence of cell-based seafood coming on board is shining the sustainability light on the seafood industry as a whole, and really all industries as a whole. So I think in the next 3 to 5 years, you're going to see everybody having a really strong sustainability initiative, changing everything in their supply chains because of that extra spotlight that's being put on them. And, either they're doing it sustainably and they get to tell their story, and that's great. Or, hopefully that supply chain just kind of shrivels up and we can move forward with sustainability, better sustainability and transparency in the supply chain. So that's what I hope to see, at least in the seafood industry, to help change the depletion of the oceans and the crisis that the oceans are facing now. So sorry, that's very specific to that one industry, but that's what I hope to see.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think it's all moving so quickly. I had a conversation with one of the executives at Cargill, maybe 2 years ago. And he was saying, we don't know when it's going to go, but when the dominoes fall, they're going to fall really fast. And I think we're seeing that now. I think the rate of change is going to be really quickly from here on out. Max, what do you think your next predictions for the 3 to 5 years to come from where you sit?
No, really, I think when we look at cell agriculture in general, there are some folks who said maybe 15, maybe 20 years, and then all of a sudden just dropped their cell-based chicken, just recently. It's going to happen a lot faster than people realize. For Turtle Tree, we actually launched something called Turtle Tree Scientific. That was a big deal. That meant that these growth factors that have been one of the biggest bottlenecks in cell agriculture in general, EGF $200,000 a gram. This stuff can't be that price when you're looking at commercializing this tech. We've been able to drop that down to dollars. This is the kind of technology needed, and we can scale it up very, very rapidly. This is going to change everything, I think. I think we're going to see products coming to the market in a matter of a few years at a much larger scale. And Turtle Tree is actually going to be doing something along the same lines with our milk. You might even get a chance to start sampling and start seeing some products to market as early as later this year. It's a lot of exciting stuff that's happening. And I think 3 to 5 years, we're going to see a lot of this stuff on the markets in probably every corner of the world.
Yeah, I'm looking to see Turtle Tree on shelf 3 to 5 years. I'm holding you to that.
Yeah.
But what you say is true. When you nail price, it's just, you can blow and the whole thing will fall over and it will change. David, what do you think 3 to 5 years from where you sit?
Yeah, so what I'm seeing, which I don't know if I have the capital resources myself or the sophistication to assess the right opportunities, but what I'm seeing is a lot of the investors who've spent the last 10 years building the alternative protein and plant-based protein sectors on the capital side are moving upstream. And I think that's really, really essential. Max was just speaking about growth factors. I've been seeing massive companies on the infrastructure side investing in building 10, 20, 30, 40, $100 million protein extrusion facilities. Yes. And every day I'm talking to investors and to companies that are, working on new extraction and extrusion technologies, that are working on identifying, new plants and new bacterial sources and myco sources of proteins. And I think the biggest thing now is consumer demand is already outpacing the innovation. And the nice thing is, as much as I'm a brand guy and I love supporting brands, and that's where I find my expertise and my time and the few resources I have, the biggest shift now is I think that we are investing in the agricultural infrastructure, the manufacturing infrastructure, and the supply chain that will enable scale to be just so much more aggressively achieved. And I think it's a wonderful thing. I think that that's what we need. I'm excited when I hear people say we're making yellow peas that will actually be better for milk or for meat alternatives. And we're focusing on taking lupin from 500,000 tons of growth per year to 30 or 40 like chickpeas and soy and wheat and rice. And that's where I think the real shift is investing in agriculture, investing in infrastructure to scale our space.
I love that you say that. I'm seeing the same thing. It used to be this bottleneck, and it still is, that there weren't enough co-manufacturing plants for the plant-based products to actually make enough scale to supply demand. You know, Brooklyn and San Francisco, they got the memo. They're not the ones who need the product. It's the rest of the country that's waiting. And you're seeing that kind of investment in infrastructure, and it's just wonderful. Jerry, from where you sit, 3 to 5 years.
So it's interesting. I completely agree with David and Max and Monica, but particularly with going upstream. The fundamental decisions that are happening now is how fast can anyone get upstream. And what's interesting about this now, which is an incredibly clear investment thesis, is that they know that the closer they get to the soil, because the degradation of the soil is happening at a faster rate. So when Monica talked about education, I do think what we'll see is a greater education on soil degradation. And I do think there'll be more investment into the soil, into going further upstream, and there will be more farmer consolidation, and I think soil will become a premium, because without that, it's becoming very difficult. So we invested in and we set up an extrusion plant in Calgary, and that we thought that was going pretty far. Like, wow, okay, this is great. But the more time we spent with the crop scientists, agronomists, it's clear the education that we had in just 6 months while we're running through this process, it was entirely game changing. It not only shifted our sustainability approach, Elizabeth, but also the investment thesis. When we would go back to the larger investors and talk about this, then we started looking at the actual technology that existed there. There was a huge opportunity for tech in the soil degradation space today, and it's massive. So I agree, going upstream, I believe we'll see a big shift, and I think that's a real value creation opportunity long term.
That's why I say the entire food supply system, because that's actually what we're talking about. We're talking about the consumer-facing products, but really then you start to think about the investments being made to change the infrastructure right down to the soil, and the new technology that's needed and the new equipment that's needed to no longer monocrop, so that you don't have carbon release from degraded soil. It's just, we are living through a complete shift. Perhaps creating a new supply shift. I don't know yet if it's a shift of our current supply system or if it's actually an entirely new one. It's so exciting. I will end here with one comment, unless anybody wanted to comment on that. Is it a completely new food supply system that we're building, or are we just tweaking and shifting? I'm curious.
I think it's new. I think there's a lot of stuff that's very new, that's changing the entire supply chain, and upstream and downstream. There's a lot of similarities, but I think that a lot of people are going to be cut out, and the system is going to be reshaped.
Coolest time to be alive. Jerry, I saw you wanted to answer there.
No, I agree. I think there are a lot of existing infrastructure today that's in the market that's being retrofitted. Oftentimes, it's easier to build a new facility and build up the new technology than it is to retrofit an asset. So I agree. Look, I think the world is moving fast. We don't know, but I think I agree. It's fun. It's exciting. It's a great place to be into this ecosystem. So thank you.
Before I close out, Monica or David, last words?
Really pleasure to be here.
Yes, Monica?
I was just going to add to that I think it's a little bit of both of fixing it first, and I think we're fixing it into a brand new system.
Yeah. I just, I'm going to have you all back so that we can have this conversation again. I almost want to say in like 6 months, because in every 6 months, even month to month, sometimes day to day, we're seeing such huge advancements. It's also very cool. I want to riff off of a couple things and then we'll close out. David had mentioned that it's important to work with industry because you're going to get those big, deep distribution channels. I want their advertising budgets, because once they start, investing in plant-based products, they're going to have to get behind it. And suddenly it's going to be manly to eat plants. And I want to see that ad campaign. And then you'll really see all the dominoes just go. And then I'll also say, from my days of working at CPG with Kellogg's, we used to always say there's a lot of equity in being first. There's a lot of weight to being a leader. So I'll leave this conversation by saying we're looking at the consumer doing the pull, and we're looking at the investors and the businesses doing the push. But I challenge them even more to come out to the forefront and to be leaders here. There's a lot to be gained from doing that. And there's no time to lose. So I want to thank everybody today for being on our panel. Max Rye, you are so awesome. All you do at Turtle Tree, thank you. David Benzaquin, founder of Mission Plant, thank you. Monica, changing the world with a plant-based seafood company. And Jerry, your expertise has really helped to round out our panel. I love hearing from you. Thank you for being with us and all that you do. That is the Foodie Show. Everybody, I'm Elizabeth Alfano. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody.